Hello, I'm Ken Enderby. I'm the president of Climate Action Burwood-Canada Bay, a very active grassroots community group based in Sydney's inner west. I'm going to talk to you today about the climate crisis and what we can do about it. I'll give you the bad news first, then I'll concentrate on the good news, of which there is quite a bit of late. Hopefully, these two things will spur you to action. First, a little bit about how I got involved in the climate movement. I've been working on issues of peace, human rights, development, and the environment for over 40 years. Since I started doing this work, I've noticed an appreciable improvement in almost every category of human endeavour. Today, there are fewer wars, less human rights abuse, less poverty, and a diminished threat of nuclear conflagration than when I started working on these things. And that's despite recent events in Ukraine. However, there's one problem that threatens to reverse all of this progress, and that is climate change. Not so many years ago, I would give a talk on climate change, and I would spend some time going over the science. But something very interesting has happened of late. The few holdout climate skeptical scientists have now conceded that the IPCC's temperature data is actually correct, and that global warming is real. This is after 2 decades of saying the opposite. One of the reasons they've held out for so long is that once you accept the temperature record, there is no other explanation for it other than greenhouse gas emissions. Global temperatures do change over 100,000-year cycles, but only at the rate of about 1 degree centigrade per 1,500 years during a thaw from an ice age. Now, that's not what we're experiencing now. We've seen 1.1 degree of warming since the beginning of the last century, half of it in the last 40 years, with no sign of this trend ending. Other explanations like solar activity and so-called natural processes don't fit with the facts and are not taken seriously by climate scientists. By contrast, the impact of carbon dioxide emissions and methane on global temperatures was first predicted by the Swedish physicist Svante Arrhenius in 1896. His predictions, using only primitive equipment, have proven to be alarmingly close to the reality. Incidentally, he won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1903, although not for his work on climate science. We've basically wasted 20 years arguing about climate change when we could have been taking action, not just in Australia, but all over the world. Now we're running out of time. We have to get on top of the problem this decade, or the consequences will be disastrous for us and for the planet. Our civilization has been based entirely on a stable climate. Global temperatures have only varied by about 0.6 degrees over the past 10,000 years, other than the past 50 years, when we've seen an unprecedented increase. As I said earlier, in the past century, we've seen temperatures rise by 1 degree centigrade, and we're heading for another 1.6 degrees if we fail to act. We're now undergoing the biggest experiment in human history. Can we survive in a significantly hotter climate, and what will a new environment look like? The answer is we just don't know. The one thing we do know is that the world our children and grandchildren will inherit will be a much harsher place than the one we grew up in. We can already see some of the impacts. More fires, more floods, more storms and droughts. If we push the planet past its tipping points, that is, melting the ice sheets or the Arctic tundra, we'll see runaway climate change and we won't be able to stop it. That's the doomsday scenario. The scientific message is that in order to keep climate changes under control, we have to keep temperature increases to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And to do that, the world has to reach net zero emissions by 2050. This doesn't mean that everybody has to get to net zero by then. Some countries, the ones responsible for putting most of the CO2 and methane into the atmosphere over the past century, will likely reach net zero much earlier. Others won't reach it until after 2050. As long as the world as a whole can reach this target, then we'll be okay. The problem is we're not presently on target to reach net zero by 2050. Even if all international commitments are met, we'll be lucky to keep temperature increases to 2 degrees. Well, that's the bad news. Now for the good news. Scientifically, we can stop temperature increases, and we can even reverse them. We haven't reached any of the tipping points yet, so there's still time to act. Scientists estimate that if we can get to net zero emissions, global temperatures will stabilize within 3 to 5 years. CO2 levels will then start to fall, as well as methane levels. The biosphere already absorbs about 60% of our emissions, And if we can get to net zero, this will accelerate. Scientists estimate that it will take about 50 years for our cumulative greenhouse gas emissions to fall by 60% and 200 years for them to fall by 80%. So the biosphere will help us if we let it. Now, technically and economically, the solutions are all at hand and are not going to break the bank. In fact, we're developing the technology to do this relatively painlessly, but we have to act swiftly. It's perfectly feasible to cut emissions by up to 75% from 1990 levels by 2030 by attacking the so-called low-hanging fruit, electricity generation and transport. Later, once new technology becomes available, we can attack the higher-hanging fruit, things like production of steel, cement, aviation fuel, and other industrial products. All of these technologies are being developed, but they'll need at least another decade to become commercially viable. Now, another piece of good news is that business is increasingly coming on side. The insurance industry has long recognised the dangers posed by global warming, but now other businesses and industry lobbying groups are joining the fight. The Business Council of Australia, the Minerals Council of Australia, the Australian Industry Group, and the National Farmers Federation have all called for urgent action on climate change. The only impediment now is political, and at the federal level, the Labor government is now committed to a reduction in emissions of 43% by 2030. We need to move much faster than this, but it's a good start. At a state level, there's also real movement, and here climate policy is essentially bipartisan. The Coalition has led the charge in South Australia and New South Wales, while Labor is doing so in Victoria, Queensland, and Western Australia. Here are some examples of what's happening in this country. The percentage of South Australia's electricity derived from renewables has gone from 0 to 64% in just 15 years. It'll be 100% well before 2030. For the country as a whole, renewables have gone from just 21% of total generation 3 years ago to 33% today in 2022. The transformation is breathtaking. Federal Labor is planning to take it to 82% by 2030. The Victorian government is planning to take it further. Globally, the transformation is also accelerating. The European Union was already committed to reaching net zero by 2050. Now, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it will dramatically bring forward its decarbonisation target. In addition, no new petrol and diesel-powered vehicles will be sold after 2035. The European Union's carbon price has risen to €50 a tonne. That is Australian $75. Britain has pledged a 68% cut in emissions by 2030 and could achieve this net zero by 2035 if the government so wished. The country gets about 60% of its electricity from renewables and nuclear now and plans to bring forward a ban on the sale of petrol-driven cars by 10 years to 2030. Incredibly, Scotland already gets 97% of its electricity from renewables, proving that it can be done. In the United States, California has passed legislation that phases out gasoline-powered cars by 2035. General Motors has made a similar commitment. Whence California, thence all of America. China now has one out of every 3 solar panels and wind turbines in the entire world. It also has almost half of the world's electric passenger vehicles, 98% of the world's electric buses, and 99% of its electric two-wheelers. Yes, it is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, but is well on track to reach peak emissions and then start reducing. Recent reports suggest that it may reach this point as early as 2025, 5 years earlier than anticipated. Finally, India is planning to build 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity by 2030. It'll be the first country to develop on renewable energy rather than on fossil fuels. And so it goes on. If every country in the world brought forward its decarbonisation pledge by just 10 years, we would get to net zero by 2050. That is not an impossible task. Unfortunately, this is not going to happen without pressure on all nations and governments, including our own. And that's where groups like ours come in. Climate Action Burwood-Canada Bay aims to educate the public about the need for climate action and to lobby politicians to act accordingly. We host forums, write reports, distribute literature, give talks like this one, and of course meet with our elected and would-be elected representatives to demand action on climate change. If you'd like someone to come and speak to your group, face-to-face if you're in Sydney, or on Zoom if you're anywhere else, just contact us via our website. We're not hard to find. Let me finish by telling you something from my own experience of historical change. 40 years ago, during the Cold War, I worked to undermine the Soviet bloc regimes, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and of course the USSR itself. I travelled extensively in those places, smuggling messages and literature to political dissidents. At the time, I saw those regimes as monolithic, almost immutable, yet they were swept away within a decade of me first visiting them. The speed of it was breathtaking. The same happened with East Timor. I remember thinking 30 years ago that it would be almost impossible to get Indonesia out, yet this happened with lightning speed. History can move very quickly, and that's what's happening now with the move to renewables. Andrew Forrest, Triggy Forrest, says that we're going to be staggered by the speed of the transition. We can already see it. The only proviso is that history often needs a push to move it in the right direction, and that's what we're trying to do now. I look back with great pride on my own role, however small it might have been, in bringing about change in the Soviet bloc and East Timor. I feel I was on the right side of history. I want it to be the same with the fight in tackling climate change. Future generations will condemn us if we don't get on top of this problem. I am determined that we will.